Welcome to all those who are watching, be it currently or in the future. Happy to have you. Lesson. So, to the book of John, this is in the New Testament. John chapter 6. We're going to be looking at verse 20. John chapter 6, verse 20. Are we there? Yes, okay, I got one nod, that's a confirmation. Okay, John chapter 6, verse 20, and the verse says, "But he saith unto them, It is I, be not afraid." So basically, what is going on in this passage right now, this is one of the passages where Jesus walks to the disciples on the water. And for those who are joining us, the topic of this lesson today is on the subject of fear. How many have ever been afraid before? I was going to say Miss Nell has never been afraid of anything before. All right. So everybody's been afraid of something at one point or another. And in this sort of intro verse that we're looking at in John verse 20, the chapter, Jesus is, I believe he withdraws himself to a mountainside so he can pray. The disciples get into a boat and start crossing probably the Sea of Galilee. They spend a lot of time there on the Sea of Galilee. And all of a sudden a storm blows up, and Jesus walks to them across the waves, which I just started realizing that in all the movies and whatnot, when you see the water like basically looks flat and Jesus walking across the top of the flat water, that doesn't actually fit the description of boisterous winds and waves. I kind of get the feeling that out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, when Jesus was walking towards them, it was more like Jesus was walking up and down mountainsides due to the fact that waves, they're not flat, especially with strong wind around. And I believe that it's at least twice in the Bible, either once or twice, one and joined him. But both of the times when Jesus started walking towards the disciples started freaking out with fear. One of the times, actually probably both times, they thought that Jesus was a ghost. And the second time, they thought the same thing. If it was two instances, they thought the same thing the second time, which all of us probably just reading it through the pages without actually being there wouldn't they have learned their lesson after the first time? But it's not exactly every day you see someone walking on water. So just bear that in mind. So the second fear, we're going to pray once more as we get started. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for letting us gather here. Thank you for all the blessings that you give to us. We ask that you'd open our minds, Father, that we might receive your word that you have for us this evening. Help us to be attentive to it, and may you be glorified in all that we say and do. In Jesus' name we ask these things. Amen. Okay. The topic is on fear, which with the last lesson that I did, how many remember what that lesson was on? It was probably my longest lesson. It was like an hour long. What? It was not on angels. It was on another emotion. No, it wasn't anger. Start naming emotions. Maybe you'll get one right. Not joy. Positivity, no. Sad. Who said sadness? Right, it was sadness. Apparently, something went wrong if they had to resort to guessing over what the topic was. It was about a month and a half or something. So that's some little studies on emotions and character traits and qualities, which this one is going to be on fear, and like that one is going to be broken down into 3 different sections. First, we're going to cover the reasons for and the instances of fear in the Bible, and then next we're an exposition on the topic of. Lastly, we're going to cover the solution for fear and how to deal with that. So, first off, we're going to be doing the reasons for and instances of fear in the Scriptures. Do we have that on? Yes, we got that. So, this is going to be number 1. If you're making an outline, this is number 1. They're going to be broken up after that into the letters A, B, C, and D. So there's going to be 3 points, and each point is going to have 4 points under. So the point is for and instances of fear in the Bible, because believe it or not, a lot of people. So point letter A of the reasons for fear is the fear of God. I think with a lot of people, unfortunately, with a lot of people, pardon me. All right. Thank you, sir. All right. Okay. Hopefully this one will do a little bit better. Sorry for that little interruption. Okay, so the fear of seeing God, that's letter A for point number 1. This one, I think that in the world that we live in today, could kind of be seen with, maybe controversy isn't the best word for it, but with some confusion, because the people that, say, reject God or don't necessarily know whether or not God exists, or if he doesn't, that would be more agnostic. By the way, the difference between agnostic and atheist, an atheist believes that there is no God, and agnostic is undecided as to whether or not there is or there isn't. So that's the difference between the two. So with atheists and agnostics, and even some Christians, when it comes to seeing God and whatnot, a lot of them could, like, if the conversation come up, say, when I see God, I'm going to have all these questions for him. and stuff like that. Or when I see God, I'm going to tell him how he could have done it right. I don't think that anyone would have that sort of arrogance to say that, but some people might. But when you find instances of people getting face-to-face with God in the Bible, it's a totally different experience for them. And the passage that I had you all look up for the first verse, Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, that is where God meets with Moses in the burning bush, where Moses meets God for the first time face-to-face anyways. And when he sees the bush on fire and the bush isn't consumed by the fire, he starts wondering, and God calls his name. He says, "Here I am." And God says, "Take off your shoes because the land you're standing on is holy ground." And then it says in that verse, as one of y'all looked up, that Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the same is true in the book of Isaiah, when Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 6, when it was, I think that it starts with one of the godly kings of Judah has just died, and because of that, Isaiah is in the temple in the middle of prayer, and all of a sudden angels start coming down from heaven, and then basically the glory cloud of God comes down into the temple itself while Isaiah is standing there in the middle of the temple. And at that point, even though Isaiah was probably one of the godliest people in Israel at the time, it says that he, I believe, fell to his knees and said, "Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the Lord of glory," or something along those lines, maybe not word for word, but that's basically what he said. And then with the other instances, like with Peter, when he realized that Jesus was God, he told Jesus, "Depart from me, because I'm a sinful man." So with that, the fear of seeing God, which that is I would say almost a positive fear. If you are afraid to see God, that is a very good thing. If you're like very chill about actually seeing God and whatnot, that's not the best mindset to have. So in those instances in the Bible, that is totally acceptable. So that's one reason for fear. The second point number B, is the fear of punishment. How many of y'all did something wrong? Well, of course, nobody in here has ever done anything wrong. But how many, when you did something wrong, and instantly there's that moment where the thought enters your mind that mom and dad are going to find out? And there's that weight. Yes, Brother Gilbert has experienced that before. So there's that weight. I've had many instances where I did something wrong, and there's instantly that feeling where your stomach sinks down to the floor, where it's like, do I tell them that I did this? Do I not? Do I try to hide it? How do I get out of this? Because out of fear, we do not like getting found guilty. And with the verse that goes with that is right after Adam and Eve sinned, and God starts walking through the garden. And Adam and Eve, probably the second after they ate the apple, they had that feeling of, oh dear, God's going to find out, which God already knew, of course. But something interesting as well, on a little side note that I'll try not to stay too long on here, but with God walking through the garden, God already knew where Adam and Eve were when they hid themselves. Yet, while God's walking through the garden, he says, "Where are you?" Not because he doesn't know, but so that he can get Adam and Eve a chance to come clean with it, which they sort of kind of do, and then all of a sudden they start playing the blame game where Adam blames his wife, and then Eve blames the snake, and the snake has no one to point to, so he can't really do anything at that point. All of them get punished because of that, but that's letter B, the fear of punishment. So everybody's experienced that fear as well. Point number C, the fear of others' opinions. This is also known as something called peer pressure, which is something that, at the very least in the United States, is a huge factor, especially in the realm of politics, which won't go into politics. But that's a big thing, and also at school when someone's doing something that's trendy or whatnot, like the media and whatnot, all of that, peer pressure plays a huge part in the world that we live in today. And in the book of Galatians, because believe it or not, people in the Bible dealt with peer pressure as well. In the book of Galatians, with the passage, Galatians was written by Paul to the church at Galatia, and in this verse, he's referencing an instance, because he's basically teaching in that letter right here, do not give in to peer pressure. And the example that he brings up is an interesting example of when Peter and some of the other disciples and the early church were in a certain place with a bunch of Gentiles, because the Jews and Gentiles, they didn't exactly mix well. So when Gentiles were allowed into the church, there was some contention as to whether or not that should be allowed. And so when Peter is spending time with all these Gentiles and whatnot, everything's going fine because that's what he should be doing. But in the passage that, or in the instance that Paul's addressing, Peter, when a bunch of Jews came over and started being around him and whatnot, they were separating themselves from the Gentiles because they're still under the Jewish law, they're unclean, and because of that, Peter got pressured into doing the same, so he actually separated himself from the Gentiles for a time, which was because of the peer pressure, which if you read the next verses after that, Galatians chapter 2, verse 12, if you're reading the next verses after that, Paul basically stands up in front of all of those people in the instance he's addressing and scolds Peter in front of all of them for giving into peer pressure when they are just as much saved as the Gentiles and whatnot. So Peter got corrected himself after that, but even Peter gave into peer pressure. All right, so that's letter C. Letter D, the fear of circumstances. This one, I think, is the more broad, universal one that everybody can, everybody can admit comfortably that they've experienced. How many are like, there's a lot of, I want to say, generic fears. There's, for instance, like spiders, the dark, heights, all that other stuff. I think those would be considered circumstantial fears, which there's not too many of those. Actually, there's a bunch of those, but there's a couple that are pretty broad, and most people have at least one of the few that are very, very general. Like, for instance, how many are afraid of heights? Wow. Okay. How many would be willing to go climb up a ladder and change the bulbs over there for Miss Anita? Yes, Brother Gilbert, thank you. Okay, I personally, if nobody else will do it, I might muster the courage to do it, but it's not something that I want to do or look forward to doing if the need arises, or probably even worse, hanging the flags for the missions conference in the sanctuary. That is something that actually causes uneasiness when we start getting ready to do the missions conference. There's always a discussion among the people who are decorating who's going to climb up the ladder to hang the flags from the ceiling in the sanctuary, which this is nothing compared to the sanctuary. It's like, well, it feels like almost twice as tall. So general fears like that. Another one for me is loud noises. That is something that really, really irritates me. Or it's more of a mental thing. Like if I'm anticipating something, it just makes it even worse. But that's just me. Other people's, it might be the dark. It might be bugs, for instance, cockroaches, spiders, that sort of thing. So everybody has some fear that they deal with. And then the verse right there, Jonah chapter 1, verse 5. Do we have that up there? Yes. That is the passage that we had, that one of y'all read as well. Brad, it was you back there because everybody else up here was frantically trying to find the book of Jonah. So Jonah chapter 1, verse 5, with that, it's sort of similar. There was a lot of storms at sea in the Bible. And with that story with Jonah, when he's trying to run away from God, which, by the way, is never a good plan, all of a sudden, while he's on the ship heading for the opposite direction of where God told him to go, all of a sudden this storm comes up, and when it says mariners, I believe is the word that it uses, the guys on the boat have been doing it for years. And I'm pretty sure that they've seen 1 or 2 storms in their day, which more than likely they've grown accustomed to it and whatnot. But at this storm that comes up, this time it's, each storm is directly caused by God, or God permits all the storms. But with this one was literally divine intervention of waking Jonah up. So if you get on, maybe not God's bad side, but if God starts disciplining you and you're in a boat, that's not a very safe combination. So anyways, these guys who were professionals at that were literally scared and start throwing stuff overboard, trying to lighten the load of the boat because they have a feeling they're going to sink. There's probably water flooding into the boat and whatnot, which is interesting to think that Jonah was asleep at the time, which kind of shows you that he's pretty distant from God if he can sleep while he knows he's running away from God, which if you read through the entire book of Jonah, it seems like he wasn't on the best terms with God throughout the entire book. But God, that doesn't mean God didn't use him. God still used him to speak to the people of the city of Nineveh, which led to, as far as we know, the greatest revival in human history. So God still used him, even though he was disobedient in that regard. So they were afraid of their circumstances as well. So that's letter A. I'm going to try to finish this out within the allotted time that I have. So point number 2, the exposition on the topic of fear. Letter A for the exposition is uncertainty is probably the primary root of most fears. Wait, I should stop looking back here. I keep wondering if that's actually up there or not. Yeah, all right, you got it. So, point number A, uncertainty is probably the primary root of most fears. With a lot of fears, for instance, like with the dark. Let's just take that for instance. How many of you were scared of the dark? All right. So here's an interesting question. Why were you scared of the dark? You don't know what's there. Exactly. For instance, I'm personally kind of scared to bring up an illustration because it might make you uneasy. And then you might actually start thinking, but like, for instance, if you're like laying in bed or something when you were younger, you didn't know whether or not there was a monster in your closet. And because it's dark, you can't even see the closet door, which just makes it even worse. So because of that, it's uncertainty. That's the biggest factor of it. There is a way, I think, to have fears where there is certainty and uncertainty is not the cause of fear or the root of the fear. For instance, this is just me personally, but I personally think that even Jesus himself dealt with fear, which might bring up a lot of people getting mad at me for stating that, but I personally consider that stress is, in a sense, fear, or dread would be a fear as well. For instance, with going to the doctor, there's a good example. When you go to the doctor to, say, get a flu shot or something, sorry if you don't like needles as well, but while there is, like, you can have certainty that you are going to get a flu shot, but doesn't mean that you're not afraid of getting the flu shot. So there is a way to have certainty about something, but still be fearful of it. In the same way, I personally think that Jesus dealt with fear, particularly before he went to the cross, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he had to separate himself and started praying earnestly. He started literally sweating drops of blood and asking God. This is another interesting subject that one could go into about when Jesus literally asks God, if there's any other way, please let that way happen. Which kind of shows you that Jesus was extremely stressed out, which there's actually proof that if you get to a point of extreme exertion with stress and whatnot, you can actually literally sweat blood, which is exactly what happened to Jesus in the garden, which a lot of people probably questioned back in the day, but now that we have science, we can find out these things, which, by the way, for Christian science is not a bad word. It is a tool. A lot of people, unfortunately, misuse it to try to lead people away from God rather than towards God, because this is a little side note as well. I have so many side notes, but science itself, just lost where this was going. All right. So anyway, I'll probably remember it in a minute. So dealing with sweating blood, a lot of times. Okay, I've just found it again. Okay, so oh dear, I think I just lost. Very interesting situation I'm in right now. Please pray for me. I would greatly appreciate that. Dealing with science, a lot of people, because a lot of people use science as the reason for explaining why there can't be a God. And ultimately, when you logically think about it, all that science has done is tell us how the universe works. And for a lot of people, unfortunately, they come to the conclusion that because we know how the universe works, therefore, there can't be a God because we know how it works now. There's a problem, though. How did it get here? We didn't make it. And on top of that, as we're finding out all the time, the universe is crazy more complex. Each time we think we've learned something, there's always something else that's way more complicated. Like when we found out that there's diseases. All of a sudden, it opens up a whole new expository, it's probably not the best word, opens up a whole new study of the different kinds of diseases, what causes diseases, what are diseases themselves, and all this other stuff. So each time we start getting a little glimpse of something with science that we discover, there's always so much more after that that makes things so much more complicated, and people use that as a claim that there's random chance which made all of this, even though each step we take gets everything more complex, which reduces the chance to what it has always been, which is absolute zero of everything coming into existence by itself. So going back to the topic of fear, that was a very long rabbit trail. Going back to the topic of fear, uncertainty is probably the primary root of most fears. So that is, now that we've covered that, there are some instances where you can be certain about something and still be fearful of it. Uncertainty is probably the biggest cause of most of them. And letter B, for point number 2, while fear isn't sin, it can lead to it if one isn't careful. This one could also deal with peer pressure very closely, like hand in hand. It could deal with peer pressure, for instance, with, let's see, who was it? King Rehoboam, for instance, who was king after King Solomon, who, after the reign of Solomon, is when the kingdom divided to north and south, which was Israel in the top and then Judah down at the bottom. So it split, and the reason because it split is because King Solomon's son Rehoboam, when the people asked him if he would basically lift all of the burdens of taxes and other things that King Solomon had put on them, he decided that he was going to talk to the elders who had worked with Solomon, and when he did, they said, the people will serve you if you lift the restrictions and the taxes that they have, but he decided that he was going to talk to his friends instead and ask them, his young friends, who said, basically, don't listen to the people. If you want more money, tax them even more. Which he made the very poor decision of giving into that peer pressure from his friends, which, by the way, he did not have the best friends. And because of that, he literally, I think word for word, said, my father chastised you with snakes, I will chastise you with scorpions. Basically saying, yeah, I'm not lifting the taxes, I'm just going to put more on you. Have a nice day. And because of that, the kingdom split between north and south, and they had several conflicts and whatnot, but because of probably the peer pressure from his friends, he was afraid probably that he would become unpopular or even lose his friends over his decision regarding that. which honestly, if those friends decided to leave him because he didn't go with that decision, that would probably be for the best, so that he would have made wiser decisions. But because he was afraid of that and feared that more than fearing losing the loyalty of the entire kingdom, the kingdom divided because of that. So fear itself isn't sin. And a lot of people, I think, can unfortunately, I believe, misread a lot of the passages where, or they could say, for instance, fear is a sin, because when you see in Scripture with the angels and whatnot, they always say, do not fear, and do not be afraid and whatnot, which in kind of the sense of the way they're saying it is an order, if you look at it from the very literal way. However, I personally think that when they say that, it's more of a statement of comfort rather than this is an order, and if you disobey it, disobey the order, you're disobeying God and you're sinning. I don't believe that that's the way that it's meant to be. For instance, if you have a son and his father, and the father is, for instance, let's go back to the dark. Say, the son, lying in his bed, thinks there's monsters in his closet. All of a sudden, his dad opens the door, and there's just this silhouette of this tall, towering man in the doorway. If his dad says, don't be scared, it's me, that is not a direct order, and if the kid is still afraid, his dad's going to spank him for it. That is not, I think, the way that that expression is used. That's more of a comfort, like, I'm here, nothing is going to happen to you. In the same way with the angels, when they would say that, that was a very reassuring way to let the person know God is not mad at you. And I'm not here to judge you. Don't be scared of that. So it's not necessarily an order, it's more of a statement of comfort rather than that. So being afraid isn't a sin, however, it can lead to one if you're not careful with it. So, letter C, moving on. Fear affects everyone, but not everyone's fear is the same. And this one kind of goes back to all the different fears that people have and whatnot, which also, just like with this, the topic of sadness and depression, a lot of people, while they may share the same fear or have different fears, a lot of them have different levels of fears. For instance, I'm trying to think of an example, like Sam, for instance. He doesn't like spiders. So, do not use that against him. Timmy, don't. So, anyways, but if, say, for instance, Sam saw a spider or something, it'd probably just make him mildly uncomfortable. But if, say, someone like my mom, for instance, she does not like cockroaches, and she will let everyone in the house know when she sees one, due to the fact of the volume of her shriek after she sees one on the floor. So different people could have different levels of the same fear. If someone is afraid of heights, for instance, someone might be mildly uncomfortable with heights, whereas somebody else will be clinging to the seat of the airplane that they're in. There was this poor lady that I was sitting next to on an airplane when I was heading back here from, I think, the Dallas area, who I noticed when I got on the airplane, and as the airplane started either taxiing down the runway or was about to take off the runway, she crosses herself. Which, and then the same when we were about to land, she did the same thing, which gave a very clear indication that she is not very comfortable with flying, which, that's fine. A lot of people are like that, and since I don't know her name, I can't really name her on that if she is watching this. But different people can have different levels of fear. Some people can share fears. Some people can have different levels of the same fear that they share. Letter D. Fear can keep people out of harm's way or keep them in harm's way. This one, for instance, how many think it's a good idea to run in the middle of the street? Did you raise your hand? No, you didn't. Okay. All right, that's a very, very valid point. So, just generally speaking, being afraid of just running into the middle of the street is a good fear to have. Do not run into the middle of the street. You'll live a lot longer if you do that. Theoretically, you'll live a lot longer. So that can keep you out of harm's way in that sense. And the same with dealing with peer pressure. If your friends are, say, jumping off the roof onto a trampoline, some people might consider that so much fun and so enthralling, whereas other people might not be that comfortable with doing that, which that would be a healthy fear. Do not jump off the roof onto a trampoline. So that in that case, it can keep people out of harm's way. However, it can keep people in harm's way. A great example of this would be a deer in the headlights. If you're ever driving someplace where there's deer or something, with a lot of those stories, like in the middle of the night, all of a sudden when the deer sees the headlights, it freezes, and it just stares at the car for probably, I don't know how long it is, what probably seems like 10 minutes for the driver that's going towards it. It just stands there. It's not moving at all because it's processing what is going on. In the same way, like a little kid in the middle of the road, for instance. If he sees a car coming towards him, there's going to be the split-second moment where he's thinking, there's a car headed straight toward me, and there's going to be that sheer terror which grips him. Sometimes it can, for instance, lead people to passing out, or even a heart attack in that sense. So fear can, in a sense, keep people in harm's way, which that's a very, very dangerous situation to be in. So moving on to the solution. I got 10 minutes. Hopefully I can finish this in that amount of time. So number 3, the solution for fear. This is where things get good. Point number A, ask God for help. That is the bare minimum that you can do, or that you should do when you're afraid of something, is to ask God for help. Which a lot of people, I think, some of them might consider some fears to be childish, and if you don't get past them later in life, they could view that as like in a negative light. However, I personally don't think that that's the case. Some people deal with certain fears longer. For instance, there could be some adults, for instance, that are scared of the dark in the same way that some kids are and whatnot. That is not, I think, necessarily a bad thing. But with each of these, no matter what your level of stress or fear is, with the passage Matthew chapter 10, let's see, verses 30 through 31. Is that on the screen? 14. Matthew chapter 14. Okay, verses 30 through 31. Do we have those verses? Yes, we do. Okay. But when he saw the wind boisterous and he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? So the question could be raised, does being afraid of something mean that you're doubting God? It depends. In this instance, Peter was paying attention more to the waves at that moment than he was on God, which brought about his fear. So at that point, his fear, he shouldn't necessarily have had, because his focus should have been on God. When he took it off of God, that's when he started being afraid. So in that sense, Jesus was walking towards him on the water, and Peter says, if that's really you, Lord, tell me to come out and walk on the water with you. Jesus said, come on, let's go. So Peter got out of the boat and started walking around the water. And in this instance, he quite literally asked God for help by saying 3 simple words, Lord, save me. That is probably one of the greatest prayers of all time, and one that anybody can repeat and anybody can use in almost any circumstance where you need help, is just that, Lord, save me. Because honestly, you can't do anything without God anyways. So asking for his assistance is a great way of recognizing God is greater than me, God is greater than my problems, and he can help me through it. So bearing that in mind is very helpful. And letter B, ask friends for help. This is one that a lot of people neglect, very sadly, especially when it comes to childish fears, as we would categorize them as. For instance, if someone, say, is a teenager or something and they're afraid of the dark or something, that's not exactly something they go around and tell everybody, just because that's awkward. It's not a comfortable conversation to bring up, talking about what you're afraid of. And I do not know who the person was who said this, but there was a person who had an amazing quote that I read, which was basically, if you want to have followers, or if you want to have an audience, tell them about your successes. But if you want to have friends, tell them what you're afraid of. Which is a very powerful and profound statement, because honestly, I think the thing that distinguishes friends from best friends, for instance, is that the best friends know so much more about the person personally that all of his other friends don't necessarily know. For instance, me and Sam are really, really close friends. In fact, we're basically best friends. And because of that, we know a lot more about each other and what each other is uncomfortable with than other people do, because we've had conversations about the stuff that we're uncomfortable with. So because of that, that distinguishes between like your more general circle of friends versus your friends that you're really, really close to. So asking friends for help with that is something that's very difficult. However, it's also very, very helpful, because with God, He can help you, and He will help you if you ask Him to. However, it's sometimes nice to be able to see the person that you're asking for help, which is why God made other people, because humans are social beings, and because God is a social being. So the reason that there's other people on the planet is so that people can be social with each other. So discussing your fears and asking for help in those regards. For instance, say, I'll just use me as an example. I don't like the loud noise of firearms, because that just drives me crazy, unless I'm the one controlling the gun. Even then, it's somewhat uneasy for me. But if there's other people around me that are shooting targets and whatnot, that makes me really uncomfortable. So in the sense, asking friends for help would, in this case, be me going over to somebody, asking them to kind of help me out, either by giving me a pair of headphones, a pair of earplugs, or asking for the keys to the car so I can drive away, or something like that. So that would be a sense of doing that in more of an immediate setting. Whereas if you're stressed about something, say for an activity like with VBS, if Miss Anita is afraid that not everything's going to be ready in time, that's the point where she goes to other people to ask them to help her out, because she doesn't think that she can finish it all. Which at that point, that would be a great thing to do. Asking for your friends for help with different things is a great thing to do. Now, letter C. This one might come as a bit of a surprise. Listening to music. How many know that music has spiritual powers? It's not just literally sound waves coming towards you. There's spiritual aspects to the music itself. For instance, a very, very, I think, obvious illustration of this is that when you're listening to something like rock music or something, all of a sudden, if somebody asks you a conversation, you might not exactly be in the best mood to talk to them, because they're interrupting you while you're listening to that. It has kind of an aggressive feel to it, which might make you somewhat more standoffish, which is not the same for everybody, and it's also not at the same level for everybody. But when I'm listening to, say, hymns or something, instrumental like piano and orchestral hymns and whatnot, I'm generally a lot more easygoing with whatever I'm working on, whereas when I'm listening to something that has more of an aggressive tone to it, suddenly I want to isolate myself into my own little world, and I don't have time for anybody else and all this other stuff that comes with it. So music does have spiritual powers to it. I mean, just look at Satan. He was literally basically the choir director in heaven. And music is one of the biggest ways he uses to tempt people, because you can persuade people to do different things through music subconsciously, because they don't know necessarily that they're thinking different things, or don't acknowledge that in their minds when they're listening to a certain type of music. However, listening to music can actually be a great benefit if you're afraid. For this instance with King Saul, because David played the harp. David was really, really good at playing the harp, so much so that one of the guys in Solomon's court, when one of his advisors told Solomon that you need to find someone who can play an instrument very, very well, so that listening to the music can basically make your anger subside. And David just so happened to be a good enough player, even though he was a shepherd out in Bethlehem. He was good enough at it to the point where somebody in King Saul's court recommended David, even though he's just a shepherd at the time. He had either heard him or heard small talk from probably the people of Bethlehem talking about how good David was at playing the harp. And so King Saul, as it says in this verse, basically summoned David to come and play the harp for him. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. Just by listening to the music that David played, which I'm pretty sure, based on the way music affects attitude and whatnot, that David was not playing heavy metal on his harp. I don't know how you could anyways, but it was with a lot of the Psalms David wrote. I have a feeling a lot of them he wrote while he was a shepherd, or had the words bouncing around in his head, because he was so close with God, to the point where God literally calls him in the Bible a man after God's own heart, which is one of the greatest compliments in the entire Bible. So David probably played very soft, very peaceful music, and then along with that, with the Psalms, he more than likely sang a couple of his Psalms to King Saul, which would make the spirit depart from Saul. And a little something else to note, when it says the evil spirit from God, that does not mean that God caused Saul to be angry, or that God necessarily sent an angel to make Saul mad and to upset him and whatnot. I think that a more easy to understand way of thinking about that is with the story of Job, when Job has everything stripped away from him. While it wasn't directly God who caused it to happen, Satan had to get permission from God for it to happen. And the same way, I have a feeling, due to the fact that the Spirit of God departed from Saul after Saul rejected God's authority and decided that he wanted to be king on his own, that I'm pretty sure it was probably literally a demon that came and possessed Saul during these times, at which point, on several occasions, he tried throwing a spear at David while he was playing his instrument. But in this sense, when it says the evil spirit from God, I believe the sense of that is God permitted that evil spirit to indwell Saul at the time, not that God caused the evil spirit to indwell Saul. So, important little distinction there. So listening to music helps a whole lot, which also, that's something that helps out if, say, you're trying to sleep, you can't sleep and whatnot. Listening to slow, peaceful music is a great help to falling to sleep. For instance, I listen to music all the time. Almost 24/7 I'm listening to music of one kind or another. But with going to sleep, I've gotten into the habit of putting on slow, quiet music, because it helps me to, avoid the silence. Because the silence bugs me when I'm lying in bed. I mean, I can still fall asleep, but it's so much easier when there's music to it that kind of makes your head start swimming, if I can use that phrase. So, last point number D. Come to Jesus. That is something that you should have done in the first place. When you're afraid, in the same way you ask God for help, in the same sense, you can literally, maybe not in the physical sense, but run to God. That is what God wants. In the same way that the children ran to Jesus when the disciples were trying to get the kids to go away from God because he doesn't have time for them, which is not true. That Jesus said, "Let the children come to me." It's that same kind of sense. A lot of people mistakenly think that God's kind of a Zeus-type character up on a cloud with a thunderbolt waiting to judge people and punish people because of their sin. That's not God. the same God of the New Testament is the God of the Old Testament as well, which, as is portrayed through Jesus, Jesus was not at all weak. He just controlled his temper. And because of that, a lot of people, when he says something like turn the other cheek and whatnot, love your enemies and whatnot, that seems kind of contrary to the God of the Old Testament, even though Jesus is God, and it's the same God from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And there are so many instances in the Old Testament of God's forgiveness, which a lot of people overlook because they're busy pointing out God's judgment on different people. So with this, let's see, these verses, Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. I actually just shared these because I work at 96.9 KVMV. There was a lady who's always calling us on the phone asking for prayer for different stuff. She has a very difficult situation with her daughter and her grandkids, which she is asking prayer so often for, which I felt that I could share these verses with her because it's great for calming someone down who's very stressed and very afraid of the future or something. This is what Jesus says, and this is from Jesus, and Jesus can't lie, and Jesus is God, so he can fulfill everything that he says. He says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek," not weak, meek. Difference between weak and meek is that weak means you don't have the power. Meek basically means you have the power, however you control it. So that's the distinction between those two. "For I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." That is a great, opening verse to someone who is unfamiliar with Jesus or with what they would refer to as the God of the New Testament, which is the God of the whole Bible. But that's what Jesus says to do. It's not judgment, fall in line, and whatnot. Jesus literally says, "Come unto me, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you because it's easy, and my burden is light." Jesus does not want people to suffer. He permits suffering to happen. However, he wants people's life to be easy with their dependency upon him because, for instance, with fear, when someone's afraid of something, it makes... I use an example. For instance, if, say, I'm drowning or something. Say I'm 8 years old or something, and I'm drowning. At that point, I'm freaking out. Fear is the number one and probably the only emotion that I'm feeling at the time. At which point, basically the only thing you can do if you don't know how to swim and you're drowning is to call out for help. At which point, if I was at that age, my dad more than likely would jump into the water and pick me up out of the water. Which, it's the same with God. God knows that we can't go through all of these different circumstances and tribulations by ourselves, which is why we need God. Which Jesus says, "Come unto me and I'll give you rest." Basically saying, if you're drowning in your worry and in your fears and whatnot, go to Jesus because he can literally pick you up out of it. Not in the sense that all of your problems will subside, but in the sense that in your spirit God can comfort you because suddenly your thought isn't on all this stuff that's going on. Your thought is on, God can help me, which God will do, but just changing that mindset can be so beneficial to making your fears maybe not completely subside, but be bearable at that point. So that's going to basically conclude it. I'm going to go ahead and close out with a word of prayer. Thank you for joining us, those who are watching online. So we're going to go ahead and have a word of prayer. Here we go. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all that you do for us. We thank you for your word, for your promises that you have. We ask that you'd be with us now. Take these lessons that we've learned, Father, on fear. Help us to apply them to our lives, Father, that we might learn to trust you more each and every day, because all of us go through different stressful events, Father, and each one is different, Father, and you know each and every one of them. We ask that you'd help us to remember, Father, that in the midst of our fears, that you can comfort us, Father, and that you, as your word says, that you do work all things together for good. We ask that you'd comfort all those people that need comforting in the world right now, and for all of us as well who are going through stressful or fearful situations. We ask that you'd comfort each and every one of them as well. And may you be glorified by everything that we say and do. In Jesus' name we ask these things. Amen. All right, before you are dismissed, are we stopped?